All right. Hi, guys. Today we'll be covering exam question 16C, which talks about the visual pathway and the visual cortical area. So, the main takeaway message for today is that visual pathway consists of four neurons. So, it's a four neuron sensory pathway. And these signals are sent to primary and secondary visual cortex, which is located at the Broman's area 17, 18, and 19, and they are located at the occipital lobe. So the visual pathway starts with three neurons at retina. We did mention that visual pathway is four neurons, but that's because our fourth neuron is at lateral geniculate nucleus, which we will talk about later. So the first order neurons are rods and cones, our photoreceptors. They transform light stimulus into electrical signal, which travels the opposite direction to the light and initiate the visual pathway. Then these are followed by our second order neuron, bipolar cells, and then by the third order neuron, ganglion cells. And these ganglion cells merges together to form the optic nerve. So once the optic nerve emerges, we can see the following 6 steps. 1. Optic nerves enter the cranial cavity through the optic canal. 2. Optic nerves from right and left converges to form optic chiasm, where axons converge across the midline. And it is very important to remember the rule: right stays right and left stays left. This means the signals from the nasoretina of the left eye, colored in red, will cross over to the contralateral side, meaning the right, because it is the right portion of that eye. Similarly, the signal from the nasal retina of the right eye, colored in green, will cross over to that of contralateral side, meaning left, because it is the left portion of that eye. Whereas the temporal retina will stay on their ipsilateral side and follow the pathway according to their respective sides. Then comes 3. Once the signals have crossed over to their respective sides, they then form an optic tract. 4. These signals travel around the peduncle and they arrive at the fourth order neuron located at lateral geniculate body, which is part of the thalamus. Number 5. These then follow the optic radiation, and 6 finally terminates at our primary and secondary visual cortical areas located at the occipital lobe.
The primary visual cortex, which is located in the calcareous sulcus, is involved in spatial information required for vision. Spatial information is really important because it helps us understand what objects or people are around us. The primary visual cortex receives this information from the lateral geniculate nucleus and sends its efferent fibers to the secondary visual cortex. The secondary visual cortex, it is the first region within the visual association area. It receives afferent fibers from the primary visual cortex directly via the pulvinar. V2, meaning the secondary visual cortex, integrates all the information from V1, the primary visual, and is able to understand it and sort of acclimate the information given to us to a more deeper degree. By that, by what I mean by that is like in primary visual cortex, your brain will understand that there's like a glass next to you. But in the secondary visual cortex, your brain will understand the specific patterns or the shapes or different colors on the glass. So the cells in this region are important to differentiate colors, spatial frequency, and object orientation. So from the secondary visual cortex, information goes to the premotor cortex and then the frontal eye field. Okay, so these are the visual cortex. Now I'll talk about some more clinically relevant information, which they'll ask you in the final. So the first thing would be the pupillary light reflex. It's basically a reflex that controls the diameter of the pupil in response to light. A greater intensity will cause constriction, known as miosis, whereas lesser intensity of light will cause dilation, known as mydriasis. The actual reflex neuronal pathway has an afferent limb and then 2 efferent limbs on both sides. The afferent limb has nerve fibers within the optic nerve, which is the second cranial nerve, and each efferent limb nerve fibers run along the oculomotor, third cranial nerve. The afferent limb carries sensory input. Anatomically, the afferent limb consists of the retina, the optic nerve, and the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain, which is at the level of the superior colliculus. The ganglion cells of the retina project fibers through the optic nerve to the ipsilateral pretectal nucleus. The efferent limb is the pupillary motor output from the pretectal nucleus to the ciliary sphincter muscle of the iris. The pretectal nucleus projects crossed and uncrossed. So crossed meaning contralateral and uncrossed meaning ipsilateral fibers to the specific Edinger-Westphal nuclei. Each Edinger-Westphal nucleus gives rise to preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, which exit with the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, and synapse with the postganglionic parasympathetic fiber or postganglionic parasympathetic neurons in the ciliary ganglion. Now these nerve fibers leave the ciliary ganglion to innervate the ciliary sphincter, and then this stimulation will either cause mydriasis or meiosis. Okay, so that was the actual neuronal pathway. Now I'll move on to accommodation. So accommodation is a process in which the actual ciliary muscles can either relax or contract, depending. They can either relax or contract to focus an object onto the eye, depending on its length, depending on how close it is to the eye. So let's say if an object is far away, your lens would be flat, whereas an object is closer, your lens would thicken, and this is where accommodation comes into play. So the thickening of the lens, or the thickening of the lens is actually known as accommodation. It is the actual phenomenon of accommodation. So some structures involved in accommodation would be ciliary muscles, lens, and the pupil. And of course, we have to know the neuronal pathway. So it consists of the actual neuronal circuit, the afferent limb, and the efferent limb, as well as you have ocular motor neurons, which connect the afferent and efferent limb pathways together. Okay, so the afferent limb consists of three of the main structures, such as retina, the chiasm, the tract, the lateral genicular body, and the visual cortex, whereas the efferent limb consists of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the oculomotor neurons. The main function of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus is to send axons in the oculomotor nerve to control the ciliary ganglion. So this is the same mechanism we saw in the pupillary light reflex. So the fibers go to the ciliary ganglion, which in turn sends this axon in the short ciliary nerve to control the iris and the ciliary muscle of the eye. The oculomotor neurons send its axons in the oculomotor nerve to control the medial rectus and converge the two eyes. When I say converge the two eyes, what happens is the actual the pupil, they move more medially. Neurons that are interposed between the afferent and efferent limbs of the circuit include the visual association cortex, which basically determines whether the image is out of focus and sends its corrective signals via the internal capsule and crus cerebri to the supraocular nuclei. The supraocular nuclei generates a motor control signal that initiates the accommodation reflex and sends these controls bilaterally to the oculomotor complex. And then hence we have accommodation taking place. David?
Yeah, so our today's take-home message, as we mentioned before, this question is fairly a simple question because it's very straightforward. The visual pathway consists of 4 neurons, starting at rods and cones, are photoreceptors, bipolar cells, then ganglion cells, which becomes optic nerve when it merges together. Then later on at our 4th neuron, lateral geniculate body, which is part of the thalamus. Yeah, and if we talk about our pathway itself, after ganglion cells merges together to form optic nerve, it becomes an optic chiasm, where we mentioned the nasal retina parts will cross over to their contralateral sides, where the right stays right and the left stays left. And these together will become an optic tract terminating at lateral geniculate body, and which continues as an optic radiation, and lastly to our visual cortical area, primary and secondary. And our primary visual cortex is at the Brodmann's area 17. Can you click for me? Oh, wait. Yeah, and our secondary visual cortex, which is located at Brodmann's area 18 and 19, and they're both located at the occipital lobe near the calcarine sulcus. And by the way, regards to the reflexes, any comments to add?
No comments, just be ready to get asked about them in your final. The professors love asking about it, so just know the actual anatomical pathway. You don't really need to know the function. It would be nice, but know the main pathway, that's for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I think visual pathway is a fairly simple, or not simple, I would say straightforward if you visualize it quite well. So yeah, that's all from us, and hope you guys find this useful, and good luck with your exams.
Thank you for listening, guys. Good luck.
All right.